He booked our anniversary dinner at the city's most exclusive restaurant, requesting a table for 4 instead of 2. 1 seat for him, 1 for our mutual friend Carmen, who he'd been sleeping with for months, 1 for my divorce attorney, and 1 for me to watch his world crumble. When he smugly told me I'd never be able to afford a place like this after our divorce, I smiled and stood up. "Curtis," I said, loud enough for the entire dining room to hear. "Meet my staff. Oh, and honey, get out of my restaurant." I'm sitting at table 12 in the heart of Manhattan's Upper East Side, at Lumiere. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A gleaming temple of culinary excellence that has become the most sought-after reservation in New York City. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors, while floor-to-ceiling windows offer breathtaking views of Central Park. The restaurant buzzes with the quiet energy of the city's elite, celebrities, politicians, and business moguls who consider a table here the ultimate status symbol. I'm impeccably dressed in a navy silk dress that speaks of understated wealth, my dark hair pulled into an elegant chignon. At 34, I carry myself with the quiet confidence of someone who has built something extraordinary from nothing. My manicured fingers trace the rim of a crystal champagne flute filled with Dom Perignon 2010. The same vintage Curtis and I shared on our wedding night 7 years ago, but tonight isn't a celebration. Tonight is an execution. Across the dining room, Curtis makes his entrance with all the swagger of a man who believes he holds all the cards. At 36, he's maintained his college athlete physique, his sandy hair perfectly styled, wearing a Tom Ford suit that costs more than most people's monthly salary. His arm is wrapped possessively around Carmen Rodriguez, my former best friend and maid of honor. Carmen, 29 and stunning in a way that turns heads, wears a red Valentino, dress that hugs every curve. Her long auburn hair falls in perfect waves, and she carries herself with the predatory grace of a woman who has stolen another woman's life and feels no shame about it. They're followed by a third man, Tanner Brooks, Curtis's high-powered divorce attorney, a shark in an Armani suit who specializes in destroying wealthy wives and leaving them with nothing. The 3 of them move through the restaurant like conquerors, Curtis nodding to acquaintances, Carmen clinging to his arm like a trophy, Tanner surveying the room with the cold calculation of a predator assessing his territory. As they settle, at table 12, the very table I reserved for our 7th anniversary dinner, Curtis catches sight of me and his expression shifts to one of cruel satisfaction. This wasn't an accident or a coincidence. This was psychological warfare, meticulously planned to inflict maximum humiliation. He had specifically chosen this restaurant knowing I had been trying to get a reservation here for months. He wanted me to see him with Carmen in the most public, most prestigious venue possible. What Curtis doesn't know is that I'm not here by accident either. I received his text 3 hours earlier. Change of plans for tonight. Taking Carmen to Lumiere instead. Don't wait up. Tanner will be joining us to discuss our future arrangements. Hope you understand, darling. The audacity was breathtaking. Not only was he flaunting his affair with my former best friend on our anniversary, but he was conducting divorce strategy sessions in public, treating our 7-year marriage like a business transaction to be dissolved. The casual cruelty of it all, the calculated timing, the choice of venue, the inclusion of Carmen, revealed a level of emotional sadism that I had been blind to for too long. As Curtis orders the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu, a 1982 Chateau Latour that costs $8,000, he begins holding court at his table. His voice carries across the dining room as he regales Carmen and Tanner with stories of his upcoming political campaign, his real estate investments, his vision for their post-divorce future. He speaks loudly enough for me to hear every word, each sentence designed to twist the knife deeper. After the divorce is finalized, he announces, cutting into a Wagyu steak that costs more than some people's weekly salary. Carmen and I are thinking of opening our own restaurant. Something tasteful, exclusive. Not like those little neighborhood places Genevieve always talks about opening someday. Carmen laughs, a tinkling sound that once brought me comfort during late-night phone calls about Curtis's neglect and now sounds like breaking glass. "Oh, Curtis, you're terrible," she purrs, but her eyes gleam with malicious delight. "Though I do think we'd be fabulous restaurant owners. We have such exquisite taste." Tanner nods approvingly, already calculating billable hours. "The prenup is ironclad," he assures them. "She'll get the minimum required by law. The house, the investments, the business contacts. It all stays with Curtis. She'll be lucky to afford a studio apartment in Queens when this is over." What none of them realize is that every word is being heard not just by me, but by Agnes Chen, Lumiere's head sommelier, who stands frozen beside their table with the wine they've ordered. Agnes's eyes meet mine across the room, and a look of understanding passes between us. Agnes has been with Lumiere since its opening 3 years ago. She knows exactly who signs her paychecks. I take a final sip of my champagne and place the glass on the marble table with deliberate precision. I smooth my dress, check my reflection in the window that overlooks Central Park, and begin the walk across the dining room that will change everything. My heels click against the marble floor with the rhythm of a countdown, each step bringing me closer to the moment when Curtis's carefully constructed world will collapse around him. As I approach table 12, conversations at nearby tables begin to quiet. There's something in my bearing, a quiet authority, a sense of impending reckoning, that makes people take notice. Curtis, still oblivious to the approaching storm, continues his performance for Carmen and Tanner, unaware that his wife is about to serve him the most expensive meal of his life. The stage is set, the players are in position, and I'm about to remind everyone in the room that in the game of revenge, the house always wins, especially when you own the house. I wasn't born into wealth, though my current life might suggest otherwise. 3 years ago, I was working 16-hour days as a line cook at a struggling bistro in Brooklyn, my culinary degree from the Institute of Culinary Education barely covering the rent on my cramped studio apartment. I had dreams that stretched far beyond the smoke-filled kitchen where I spent my days perfecting sauces and plating dishes that would never earn me recognition. What Curtis never knew, what no one knew except the small circle of investors and legal advisors who helped me build my empire, was that I had inherited more than just my grandmother's recipe collection when Molly Sullivan passed away 2 years into my marriage. Hidden in her effects was a safety deposit box key and a letter that would change everything. Inside that box were bearer bonds worth $2.3 million. Money Molly had quietly accumulated over decades of smart investments. Money she'd kept secret from everyone, including her own family. The letter was simple. "Genevieve, you're the only one who inherited my business sense along with my love of cooking. Build something that matters. Make it yours completely. Trust no one with this secret until you're ready to wield the power it gives you." Lumiere hadn't been Lumiere when I first found it. It was La Petite Maison, a failing French restaurant on the Upper East Side with a prime location, beautiful bones, and an owner drowning in debt. The previous owner, Chef Michel Dubois, was on the verge of bankruptcy, his dream crumbling under poor management and even worse financial decisions. I approached him through a shell company, Sterling Hospitality Group, with an offer he couldn't refuse. I would purchase the restaurant, renovate it completely, and rebrand it as Lumiere. Michel could stay on as head chef with a generous salary and full creative control over the menu, but I would own everything. The paperwork was designed to obscure my identity. To anyone looking from the outside, Sterling Hospitality Group appeared to be owned by a consortium of anonymous investors. The renovation took 8 months and cost another $1.8 million. I oversaw every detail personally, from the imported Italian marble floors to the custom-designed crystal chandeliers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I hired the best. Agnes Chen from Le Bernardin as head sommelier, Evan Martinez as general manager from Daniel, Mike Thompson as executive sous chef from 11 Madison Park. I paid them well enough to ensure their loyalty and discretion. During the day, I transformed myself into the perfect political wife. I attended Curtis's campaign events, smiled for photographs, and played the role of the supportive spouse building his career in real estate development. I managed our Upper West Side penthouse, entertained his business associates, and never once let slip that I had built something extraordinary while he was busy climbing his own ladder of ambition. Curtis believed my inheritance from Molly had been modest, maybe $50,000 that went toward paying off my student loans. He never questioned where I spent my days when I said I was exploring my options or taking some time to figure out my next career move. He was too focused on his own pursuits to notice that his wife had quietly become one of the most successful restaurateurs in Manhattan. The irony wasn't lost on me that Curtis often complained about our inability to get reservations at exclusive restaurants. "It's all about connections," he would say dismissively. "When I'm elected to city council, we'll have access to places like Lumiere. Right now, we're just not important enough." I would nod sympathetically, all while knowing that with a single phone call, I could secure any table in my restaurant at any time. But maintaining the secret had become part of the strategy. Let him believe he was the one with power and connections. Let him think I was dependent on him for access to the world I wanted to inhabit. What Curtis also didn't realize was that I had built more than just a restaurant. Lumiere had become a gathering place for New York's power brokers, and I had cultivated relationships with every one of them. The mayor dined here monthly. Federal judges celebrated anniversaries at Table 7. Media moguls sealed deals over my chef's tasting menu. I knew their preferences, their secrets, their weaknesses. Information flowed to me like wine flows to a sommelier, naturally, abundantly, and with perfect timing. When Senator Patricia Hayes needed a discreet venue for sensitive political discussions, she called me. When tech billionaire David Chen wanted to propose to his longtime partner away from paparazzi, Lumiere's private dining room provided the perfect sanctuary. I never asked for favors in return. I simply provided impeccable service, absolute discretion, and an atmosphere where powerful people felt comfortable being themselves. But I remembered everything. Every conversation overheard, every alliance formed over appetizers, every betrayal discussed over dessert. 6 months ago, when Curtis first started coming home with Carmen's perfume on his clothes, I had briefly considered confronting him immediately. I could have hired a private investigator, gathered evidence, and filed for divorce with the full force of my hidden wealth behind me. But then I realized something far more delicious. Curtis was planning to destroy me using my own restaurant as the venue for his victory lap. The audacity was breathtaking, but it was also the perfect gift. He was handing me the opportunity to expose his betrayal in the most public, most humiliating way possible, in front of the very people whose respect and connections he desperately craved. Tonight wasn't just our anniversary. It was opening night for the most spectacular show Lumiere had ever hosted, and Curtis Sterling was about to discover that he'd unwittingly bought himself a front-row seat to his own destruction. As I continued my measured walk across the marble floor toward Table 12, I caught Agnes's eye and gave the slightest nod. Phase 1 was about to begin. The text message arrived at exactly 3:47 p.m. while I was reviewing quarterly financial reports in my home office. Curtis thought I was looking at freelance catering opportunities. Another one of my carefully constructed lies. In reality, I was analyzing Lumiere's profit margins, which had exceeded projections by 18% in the third quarter alone. Change of plans for tonight. Taking Carmen to Lumiere instead. Don't wait up. Tanner will be joining us to discuss our future arrangements. Hope you understand, darling. I stared at those words for a full minute, my coffee growing cold in the eye's eye. Her mess cup Curtis had given me for our last anniversary. The casual cruelty was breathtaking. Not just the affair, I'd suspected that for months, but the calculated timing, the choice of venue, the inclusion of his divorce attorney. He was conducting psychological warfare disguised as a dinner reservation. What made it even more devastating was the choice of Carmen. We'd been inseparable since college, bonding over late-night study sessions and shared dreams of conquering New York. She'd been my maid of honor, the first person I called when Curtis proposed, the shoulder I cried on when our marriage started showing cracks. The betrayal cut deeper than any affair with a stranger ever could. But there was something else in that message that Curtis couldn't have known would be the fatal flaw in his plan. Lumiere, my restaurant, the empire I'd built in secret while he patronized me about my little cooking dreams. He'd chosen to destroy our marriage in the very place where I held all the power, and he had no idea. I set down my coffee and reached for my personal phone, not the one Curtis occasionally checked, but the encrypted device I used for all Lumiere business. 3 quick calls would set everything in motion. Agnes, it's me. I need you to personally handle table 12 tonight. My husband will be dining there with 2 guests. Full VIP treatment, but I want you to observe everything and report back. Evan, clear table 15 for tonight. I'll be dining alone, but position it with a clear view of 12. Standard service, nothing that draws attention. Mike, I need you to prepare something special for dessert, something that will make an impression. We're hosting a very important performance tonight. Each person I spoke with understood immediately. They'd been with me since the beginning, had seen me build Lumiere from the ruins of La Petite Maison. More importantly, they'd become protective of what we'd created together. When I explained that my husband was planning to humiliate me in my own restaurant, their responses were swift and certain. Whatever you need, Agnes said, her voice carrying the steel that made her one of the most respected sommeliers in the city. Consider it done, Evan replied, already mentally rearranging the evening's seating chart. This is going to be legendary, Mike added with dark satisfaction. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of preparation. I showered and dressed with the care of a general preparing for battle. The navy silk dress wasn't chosen randomly. It was Curtis's favorite, the one I wore to his campaign launch party where he'd proudly introduced me as his secret weapon. Tonight, he was about to discover just how accurate that description was. I arrived at Lumiere at 7:30, 90 minutes before Curtis's reservation. The staff who knew my true identity greeted me with subtle nods, while those who didn't simply saw another elegantly dressed patron. I took my position at table 15, ordered the Dom Perignon that Curtis and I had shared on our wedding night, and settled in to wait. At 8:45, I watched through the floor-to-ceiling windows as a black town car pulled up outside. Curtis emerged, first checking his reflection in the window before helping Carmen out of the vehicle. She was stunning in red Valentino, probably purchased with money from our joint account that Curtis controlled. Behind them, Tanner Brooks unfolded his considerable height from the car, straightening his Armani suit with the casual arrogance of a man who made his living destroying lives. The maitre d', Evan, greeted them with perfect professionalism, though I caught the slight tightening around his eyes as Curtis made a show of dropping my name. My wife tried to get a reservation here for months, he said loudly enough for nearby patrons to hear. Lucky for us, I have better connections. They were seated at table 12 with great ceremony, Curtis clearly enjoying what he believed was his moment of triumph. I watched as Agnes approached with the wine list, her expression perfectly neutral, as Curtis made a great show of ordering the most expensive bottle available. The 1982 Chateau Latour was nearly $8,000, more than many people made in a month. Carmen played her part perfectly, gasping at the opulence, touching Curtis's arm with practiced intimacy, casting occasional glances around the rye. dining room to see who was watching their performance. She wore my former friendship like an accessory, something to make her conquest of my life more complete. But it was Tanner's presence that revealed the true scope of Curtis's calculation. This wasn't just infidelity. It was a complete dismantling of our marriage disguised as a romantic dinner. I could see him occasionally pulling out his phone, taking notes, probably documenting my absence for future custody and financial proceedings. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I overheard Curtis explaining to a neighboring table that he was treating his campaign manager to a celebration dinner. Campaign manager. So that's how he was publicly explaining Carmen's role in his life. It was brilliant, really. A perfectly legitimate reason for intimate dinners, weekend trips, and late-night strategy sessions. As the evening progressed and Curtis grew more confident in his performance, his voice carried further across the dining room. He began regaling his companions with stories of our marriage, painting me as the struggling, dependent wife who would be lost without his support and connections. Each word was carefully chosen to establish a narrative for their divorce proceedings. Genevieve has such quaint ideas about opening a little neighborhood cafe someday, he said, cutting into his Wagyu steak. Sweet, really, but completely unrealistic. She has no head for business, no understanding of what it takes to succeed in this city. I took another sip of champagne and smiled. In approximately 15 minutes, Curtis Sterling was about to receive the most expensive education of his life. Watching Curtis perform for his audience while Carmen hung on his every word was like watching a master class in psychological cruelty. But what hurt most wasn't the affair itself. It was seeing my former best friend participate so willingly in my humiliation. Carmen knew things about me that Curtis had never bothered to learn. She knew about my childhood dreams of opening a restaurant, about the nights I stayed awake sketching menu ideas, about the cooking shows I watched religiously while Curtis dismissed them as background noise. She'd been there during our engagement when Curtis first started showing his true colors. I remembered calling her in tears after he'd casually mentioned that I should probably give up the cooking thing once we were married, since his political career would require a wife who could focus full-time on supporting his ambitions. Carmen had held me while I cried, assured me that I deserved better, encouraged me to fight for my dreams. Now she was sitting at my table, in my restaurant, wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, playing the role of the sophisticated woman who understood Curtis's ambitions in ways his silly, domestic wife never could. I watched her lean forward as Curtis explained his 5-year political plan, her eyes bright with the kind of attention I used to give his endless monologues about city council politics and real estate development opportunities. She nodded at all the right moments, asked insightful questions about campaign strategy, made him feel like the brilliant, visionary leader he desperately wanted to be. The comparison was inevitable and painful. While Carmen appeared polished and professional in her designer dress and perfect makeup, I suddenly felt acutely aware of every flaw Curtis had ever pointed out about me. My hands, which he'd once called work-worn, after I'd spent a weekend learning bread-making techniques. My hair, which he'd suggested I should style more professionally if I wanted to be taken seriously at his political events. My wardrobe, which he'd gradually influenced toward more conservative, wife-appropriate choices. For a moment, I was 27 again, standing in the bathroom of our first apartment, staring at my reflection after Curtis had helpfully suggested that I might want to lose a few pounds before his law firm's holiday party. I'd starved myself for 2 weeks, bought a dress I couldn't afford, and smiled until my face hurt while his colleagues' wives discussed their charity work and vacation homes in the Hamptons. The memories came flooding back, 7 years of small compromises that had slowly eroded my sense of self. The cooking classes I'd stopped taking because they conflicted with his networking events. The job interviews I'd turned down because they would require evening or weekend work that might interfere with his social obligations. The friends I'd gradually lost touch with because Curtis found them too bohemian or not serious enough for our lifestyle. I'd convinced myself it was temporary, that once Curtis's career was established, once we were financially secure, I could pursue my own dreams. But watching him with Carmen, I realized he'd never intended for that day to come. He'd systematically dismantled my independence while making me feel grateful for his guidance. Carmen had witnessed all of this. She'd been my confidant through every frustration, every moment of doubt, every time I'd questioned whether I was losing myself in my marriage. She'd encouraged me to stand up for my dreams, to demand more respect, to recognize my own worth. And now she was living the life she'd convinced me I deserved, while I sat alone watching them celebrate what they clearly saw as their victory. The worst part was how natural they looked together. Curtis was more animated than I'd seen him in years, his gestures more expansive, his laugh more genuine. Carmen brought out a side of him that I'd forgotten existed, the charming, ambitious man I'd fallen in love with in college. They shared inside jokes about campaign events I hadn't been invited to, discussed mutual acquaintances I'd never heard of, made plans for a future that didn't include me. For a brief, devastating moment, I wondered if they were right to be together. If Curtis had simply outgrown our marriage and found someone who better matched his evolving ambitions. If I was holding him back from becoming the man he was meant to be. If my dreams of opening a restaurant were really as naive and unrealistic as he'd always suggested. Tanner's presence at the table added another layer of humiliation. This wasn't just a romantic dinner. It was a business meeting disguised as a celebration. I could see him occasionally taking notes on his phone, probably documenting my absence for future proceedings. They were planning my destruction while enjoying an $8,000 bottle of wine that Curtis would undoubtedly charge to our joint credit card. I thought about our early days together, when Curtis used to call me his secret weapon and brag about my cooking to anyone who would listen. He'd bring colleagues home for dinner just to show off my talents, claiming that a man was only as good as the woman behind him. Those dinners had made me feel valuable, important, like I was contributing to our shared success. But somewhere along the way, my cooking had become an expectation rather than a gift. Curtis started critiquing my menus, suggesting modifications based on his colleagues' dietary preferences, treating our dinner parties like political events that required strategic planning rather than creative expression. My passion had become another tool in his arsenal, and when it stopped serving his purposes, he'd begun systematically devaluing it. The champagne tasted bitter as I watched Carmen reach across the table to touch Curtis's hand. It was a gesture I'd made countless times in this exact same scenario. The supportive touch, the encouraging smile, the silent communication that said, "You're brilliant, and I believe in you." Except when I'd done it, Curtis had barely noticed. With Carmen, he immediately turned his palm up to capture her fingers, bringing her hand to his lips for a kiss that made several nearby diners smile at what they assumed was young love. I finished my champagne and signaled for another glass. In 10 minutes, I was going to walk across this dining room and remind Curtis Sterling exactly who he'd chosen to betray. But first, I needed to let myself feel the full weight of what I was losing. Not just a marriage, but the version of myself I'd been trying to become for him and the friend I'd trusted with my deepest vulnerabilities. The moment that changed everything wasn't Curtis's betrayal or even Carmen's participation in my humiliation. It was when I saw Tanner Brooks pull out a manila folder and spread documents across the white tablecloth of table 12, my table, in my restaurant. Through the soft lighting, I could make out the letterhead of Curtis's law firm and what appeared to be property deeds and financial statements. They weren't just celebrating their affair. They were carving up my life like the Wagyu steak on Curtis's plate. "The prenup is quite comprehensive," Tanner was explaining to Carmen, his voice carrying just enough for me to catch fragments. "She signed away rights to most marital assets, including any business ventures initiated during the marriage." Very forward-thinking of Curtis. Carmen leaned in, studying the documents with the intensity of someone examining a treasure map. What about the Upper West Side penthouse? Purchased before the marriage, solely in Curtis's name. She has no claim. My hands trembled as I reached for my champagne. The prenup. I remembered that day 7 years ago when Curtis had presented it to me just 3 weeks before our wedding. His father's lawyers had drafted it, he'd explained apologetically. Just a formality, really, but necessary given his family's real estate holdings and his political aspirations. I'd been so in love, so trusting, that I'd barely read it before signing. But what they didn't know, what no one knew except Molly's lawyer and my own carefully chosen financial advisors, was that I'd inherited my grandmother's fortune after our marriage. Every dollar I'd used to build Lumiere was technically separate property, acquired through inheritance during the marriage, and carefully protected through shell companies and trusts that Curtis had never discovered. The prenup that Curtis thought would leave me destitute actually couldn't touch the empire I'd built in secret. His lawyers had been so focused on protecting his assets that they'd inadvertently created the perfect legal framework to protect mine. She'll be lucky to qualify for alimony, Tanner continued, clearly enjoying his role as the architect of my destruction. Given that she hasn't worked in years and has no marketable skills, the court will likely award minimal support. Certainly, not enough to maintain her current lifestyle. Curtis laughed, a sound that once brought me comfort and now felt like glass in my ears. Genevieve always talked about opening a little cafe someday. Maybe this will finally force her to get realistic about her capabilities. Carmen's response made my blood freeze. A cafe? How quaint. I suppose everyone needs to have dreams, no matter how small. The condescension in her voice revealed something I'd been too naive to see. This wasn't a recent affair born of passion or circumstance. This had been calculated, methodical, a long-term strategy to replace me in every aspect of Curtis's life. Carmen had been studying me, learning my weaknesses, positioning herself as everything I wasn't, sophisticated where I was earthy, politically savvy where I was idealistic, ambitious where I was content. She'd been there for every private conversation, about my insecurities, every moment of doubt about my marriage, every frustration with Curtis's increasing emotional distance. She'd encouraged me to confide in her, to trust her with my deepest fears about whether I was good enough for Curtis's world. And all along, she'd been using that information to perfect her own performance as my replacement. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about losing my husband to another woman. This was about losing myself to someone who had systematically studied and copied everything I was, then refined it into a version Curtis preferred. Carmen had become the woman I might have been if I'd been willing to completely abandon my own dreams and identity. But there was something they couldn't copy, couldn't steal, couldn't replicate. The strength I'd inherited from Molly Sullivan. My grandmother had built her fortune through sheer determination, working double shifts at a diner while secretly investing every spare dollar in real estate and municipal bonds. She'd taught me that true power came not from what people saw, but from what they never suspected. Power, she'd told me the day she gave me the safety deposit box key, is like the best seasoning, most effective when you can't taste it, but it transforms everything. Watching Curtis and his accomplices plan my destruction in my own restaurant, I finally understood what she meant. They thought they were the predators and I was the prey. They had no idea they were performing their cruelty on my stage, surrounded by my people, completely at my mercy. The documents spread across their table represented Curtis's attempt to control a narrative that was already over. While he'd been planning to leave me with nothing, I'd been building something he couldn't even imagine. While he'd been teaching Carmen to replace me, I'd been becoming someone he'd never really known. The hurt was still there, sharp and immediate, but it was transforming into something more powerful. This wasn't just about exposing their betrayal anymore. This was about reclaiming not just my dignity, but my grandmother's legacy of quiet strength and strategic patience. I caught Agnes's eye across the dining room and gave her the subtlest of nods. Phase 2 was about to begin. My phone buzzed with a text from Agnes. Table 12 requesting private dining room for business discussion. Should I accommodate? I smiled as I typed back. Absolutely. The Wellington Room. Make sure they're completely comfortable. The Wellington Room was Lumiere's most exclusive private dining space, soundproofed and equipped with discreet recording capabilities that I'd had installed for VIP clients who valued absolute privacy. What Curtis didn't know was that the room also had a two-way mirror disguised as artwork, a remnant from the space's previous incarnation as a speakeasy during Prohibition. 20 minutes later, I watched as Agnes gracefully guided Curtis, Carmen, and Tanner toward the back of the restaurant. Curtis was clearly pleased with what he perceived as special treatment, probably assuming his name-dropping had finally earned him the respect he craved. Carmen clutched his arm possessively, her eyes bright with the thrill of being part of what she believed was high society dining. Once they were settled in the Wellington Room, I made my way to the adjacent service area where I could observe through the concealed mirror. Evan was already there, having anticipated my needs with the efficiency that made him invaluable. Audio is crystal clear, he murmured, adjusting the discreet recording equipment. Whatever they discuss, we'll have documentation. Through the mirror. I watched Curtis spread the divorce documents across the mahogany table with the ceremony of a general planning a military campaign. The sight was both infuriating and pathetic, my husband conducting the dissolution of our marriage like a board meeting, complete with charts and financial projections. The beauty of this, Tanner was explaining to Carmen while pointing at various sections of the prenup, is that Genevieve signed away rights to any business ventures or properties acquired during the marriage. Since she's been unemployed for 7 years, she has no independent income stream. Carmen studied the documents with surprising intensity. What about her inheritance from her grandmother? Wasn't there some money from that? Minimal, Curtis waved dismissively. Maybe $50,000, which went toward paying off her student loans. Molly Sullivan died practically penniless, spent her whole life working at that diner downtown. I had to grip the edge of the observation counter to keep from laughing out loud. Curtis's ignorance of my grandmother's true financial acumen was about to cost him everything. The timeline is crucial, Tanner continued, pulling out his phone, to show them something. I've been documenting Genevieve's absences from important campaign events, her lack of interest in Curtis's political career, her increasing isolation from their social circle. We can easily establish a pattern of abandonment and lack of support. She's been so distant lately, Carmen added with false sympathy. Always making excuses about having headaches or being tired. Poor Curtis, you've been carrying this marriage, alone for months. The lies were so smoothly delivered that I almost admired their audacity. Every absence they were documenting had been a day I spent at Lumiere, building the empire they couldn't imagine. Every headache had been exhaustion from working 18-hour days to establish the most successful restaurant opening in Manhattan's recent history. Curtis pulled out his own phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be photographs. I've been documenting her declining appearance and obvious depression. Look at this picture from last month's fundraiser. She looks absolutely miserable. I remembered that event. I'd been exhausted from 3 consecutive nights of catering private events for senators and tech moguls, building the network that now made Lumiere the most sought-after venue in the city. But in the photo Curtis was showing them, I simply looked tired and withdrawn. The narrative writes itself, Tanner said with satisfaction. Devoted husband builds successful career, while wife becomes increasingly unstable and unsupportive. He tried everything to save the marriage, but ultimately had to choose between his duty to the public and his personal happiness. And then I stepped in to help, Carmen added, her voice dripping with false modesty. Just as a friend at first, of course. Someone who understood the pressures of political life and could provide the support Curtis needed. Exactly, Curtis beamed at her like she'd just solved world hunger. Carmen represents everything I need in a political partner. She's intelligent, sophisticated, understands the demands of public service. I watched him reach across the table to take her hand, his wedding ring catching the light from the crystal chandelier I'd personally selected for this room. The gesture was intimate, practiced, clearly not the first time they'd discussed their future together in such detail. But what truly stunned me was the level of planning they'd put into this. Carmen pulled out her own folder, filled with what appeared to be political strategy documents, campaign donor lists, and event planning materials. She'd been positioning herself not just as Curtis's mistress, but as his professional partner. The role I'd been systematically excluded from as his ambitions grew. The donor base responds very well to me, she was explaining, particularly the younger demographic and women voters. Your approval ratings among married women have been problematic, but with me beside you, we can completely reshape that narrative. They weren't just planning to destroy my marriage, they were planning to use my destruction as a cornerstone of Curtis's political rebranding. The wronged husband who chose duty over personal happiness. The political star who found true partnership. With a brilliant campaign manager after years of carrying a burden alone. I pulled out my own phone and sent a quick message to my lawyer. Emergency meeting tomorrow morning. We'll need complete financial disclosure protection and offensive strategy. Bring everything. Then I texted my private investigator. Need full background on Carmen Rodriguez and Tanner Brooks. Priority rush. Expense no object. Finally, I messaged Mike in the kitchen. Prepare the special dessert service for the Wellington room. They're about to get exactly what they deserve. Listening to Curtis dismiss my grandmother as a poor diner waitress who died practically penniless ignited something fierce in my chest. He had no idea what Molly Sullivan had really accomplished, or the legacy of strength and cunning that ran through the women in my family like a golden thread. Molly had started working at Mickey's Diner on the Lower East Side in 1963, when she was just 18 and fresh off the boat from County Cork. To everyone who knew her, she was simply another Irish immigrant girl serving coffee and pie to construction workers and cab drivers. What they didn't see was the brilliant mind that memorized every conversation, cataloged every piece of information, and slowly built a network that would span 5 decades. The diner was more than a restaurant. It was the unofficial headquarters for half the city's power brokers. Police commissioners planned raids over their morning coffee. Real estate developers sketched deals on napkins during late-night strategy sessions. Union leaders brokered peace agreements over Molly's famous shepherd's pie. And through it all, my grandmother listened, learned, and quietly accumulated secrets that she would never use maliciously, but would always remember. By 1970, Molly had saved enough from her tips and modest salary to make her first real estate investment, a small apartment building in Brooklyn that everyone said was in a terrible neighborhood. She paid cash, using money she'd kept hidden in coffee cans under her kitchen floorboards. Within 5 years, gentrification had tripled the property's value. She repeated this pattern throughout the 70s and 80s, always staying one step ahead of New York's constantly shifting real estate market. While other investors relied on banks and borrowed money, Molly used only cash, making deals that left no paper trail and attracted no attention. To her neighbors, she was still just the friendly Irish woman who worked at the diner. To the handful of lawyers and accountants who handled her affairs, she was one of the most successful real estate investors in the city. But Molly's real genius wasn't in the money she made. It was in how she made herself invisible while doing it. She never flaunted her wealth, never changed her modest lifestyle, never gave anyone reason to suspect that the cheerful waitress serving their breakfast owned half their neighborhood. She understood something that most wealthy people never learn. True power comes from people underestimating you. The safety deposit box I'd inherited contained more than just bearer bonds. It held decades of carefully organized records, property deeds, investment statements, and detailed notes about every significant conversation she'd overheard at Mickey's Diner. There were also photographs of handshake deals, copies of contracts that were supposed to be private, and documentation of agreements that powerful men thought had been forgotten. My grandmother had never used this information for blackmail or manipulation. Instead, she'd used it for protection, ensuring that no one could ever surprise or destroy her because she always knew what was coming. The records were her insurance policy, her way of guaranteeing that a poor Irish immigrant would never be vulnerable to the whims of powerful men again. When she passed away 3 years into my marriage, Molly left me more than money. She left me a masterclass in strategic invisibility and the tools to build my own empire. Her letter had been specific. Men like Curtis see what they expect to see. Let them. While they're looking down on you, you'll be building something they can't imagine. I'd followed her advice perfectly. While Curtis saw a struggling wife trying to find herself, I was systematically acquiring the failing La Petite Maison and transforming it into Lumière. While he dismissed my little cooking dreams, I was hiring the most talented chefs and staff in Manhattan. While he patronized me about my lack of business sense, I was creating the most exclusive dining destination in the city. The irony wasn't lost on me that Curtis had proposed to me at Mickey's Diner, the same place where my grandmother had spent 50 years building her fortune. He'd chosen it because he thought it was authentic and showed he could appreciate simple pleasures. He'd had no idea he was proposing in the headquarters of an empire, or that the sweet old woman who served his coffee and insisted the meal was on the house was actually one of the wealthiest women in New York. Molly had died 6 months after our wedding, but not before she'd met Curtis several times. I remembered her pulling me aside after one of those meetings, her weathered hands gentle but her eyes sharp with concern. "That one sees people as stepping stones," she'd warned me. "He's charming enough, and he might even love you in his way. But when his ambition outgrows his gratitude, you'll need to be ready." She'd been right, of course. Curtis had loved the version of me that supported his goals and reflected well on his image. But as his political aspirations grew, that version had become insufficient. He needed someone more polished, more strategic, more willing to sacrifice everything for his success. What he'd never understood was that I'd been willing to sacrifice everything. I'd just been smart enough to build something even greater in secret while I did it. Now, watching him plan my destruction in my own restaurant, I felt the full weight of Molly's legacy flowing through me. 3 generations of Sullivan women had survived by being underestimated, and tonight, Curtis Sterling was about to learn why that was a dangerous mistake. I met Curtis Sterling on a rainy Tuesday in October, 7 years ago, when he walked into Mickey's Diner looking like he'd stepped out of a magazine. I was covering for my grandmother, who had called in sick with what she claimed was a cold, but I suspected was actually a strategic absence. She'd been tracking Curtis's career since he'd announced his first city council campaign, and I later realized she'd orchestrated our meeting with the precision of a master chess player. He ordered coffee and the daily special, meatloaf, that Molly had perfected over decades, while reviewing campaign materials spread across the worn Formica table. I was 27, fresh out of culinary school, and working 3 jobs to pay off student loans while dreaming of opening my own restaurant someday. He was 29, Harvard law graduate, and already making waves in local politics with his idealistic speeches about urban renewal and community development. "You're not from around here," I said, refilling his coffee cup and noticing his expensive suit and manicured hands. "Upper West Side," he admitted with a self-deprecating smile. "But I'm trying to understand all the neighborhoods I want to represent. This place has character." He asked about the diner's history, about the neighborhood, about my own story. Unlike most politicians who asked questions while obviously waiting for their turn to talk, Curtis actually listened. He took notes about local concerns, asked for my contact information in case he had more questions about the community, and left a tip that was generous but not showy. 3 days later, he called and asked if I'd be willing to help him understand more about the neighborhood over dinner. Not at some fancy restaurant, he specified, but somewhere locals actually ate. I suggested a tiny Ethiopian place that had just opened 6 blocks away, expecting him to suggest something more conventional. Instead, he met me there an hour early and had already ordered appetizers for us to share. That first date lasted 4 hours. We talked about everything: his vision for the city, my dreams of opening a restaurant, his complicated relationship with his wealthy parents, my pride in my grandmother's work ethic. He told me about growing up with privilege but feeling disconnected from the communities his family's money was supposed to help. I told him about watching my grandmother turn serving coffee into an art form, how she knew every customer's story and somehow made everyone feel important. "You see people the way I want to learn to see them," he said as we walked through the rain toward the subway. "Real, not as demographics or voting blocks." The courtship was intense and romantic in ways I'd never experienced. Curtis introduced me to worlds I'd only read about: Broadway shows, art gallery openings, dinners at restaurants where a single meal cost more than I made in a week. But he also insisted on experiencing my world, helping at community events, eating at the hole-in-the-wall places I loved, listening to my grandmother's stories about old New York. What impressed me most was how he treated Molly. Many of my previous boyfriends had been polite but condescending toward her, clearly seeing her as beneath their notice. Curtis engaged with her like she was a political advisor, asking detailed questions about neighborhood changes, gentrification patterns, and community needs. He quoted her insights in campaign speeches and credited her with helping him understand issues he'd never considered. "Your grandmother is remarkable," he told me after one particularly long conversation with Molly about affordable housing. "She has the kind of wisdom you can't learn in school." 6 months into our relationship, Curtis proposed at Mickey's Diner, during the late-night shift when only a few regulars and cab drivers were around. He'd arranged for Molly to work that night, though I didn't realize it was planned until later. The ring was modest by his family's standards, but perfect for me. A classic solitaire that had belonged to his grandmother. "I want to build something real," he said, dropping to one knee beside table 7 where we'd first talked about our dreams. "Not just a political career, but a life that matters. I want to do that with you." Molly had tears in her eyes as she brought out a piece of apple pie with a single candle. "On the house," she announced, though I later learned Curtis had paid for the entire diner that night, giving Molly the freedom to close early so our celebration could be private. The wedding was everything I'd dreamed of. Intimate ceremony in Central Park, reception at a small restaurant Curtis had discovered in Little Italy, guest list limited to people who actually mattered to us rather than political contacts or family obligations. Carmen was my maid of honor, radiant in the pale blue dress we'd chosen together. She gave a toast about finding love that was both passionate and grounded, about Curtis and me being proof that opposites could create something beautiful together. "Genevieve makes Curtis more human," she'd said, raising her glass. "And Curtis makes Genevieve dream bigger. Together, they're going to change this city." The first 2 years of marriage felt like an extended honeymoon. Curtis included me in everything: campaign strategy sessions, policy discussions, social events with donors and community leaders. I cooked for his colleagues, hosted dinner parties that became legendary among his political circle, and gradually transformed from diner waitress to political wife without losing myself in the process. Or so I thought. The change started so gradually that I didn't recognize it at first. Curtis began helping me choose outfits for important events. He suggested I take a break from my restaurant dreams to focus on supporting his career during this crucial period. He introduced me to personal trainers and nutritionists who could help me optimize my potential. Each suggestion came with love and logic, presented as caring guidance rather than criticism. And because I loved him, because I wanted his success as much as he did, I listened. I trusted. I changed. The erosion of my identity didn't happen overnight. It was so subtle, so carefully orchestrated, that I convinced myself I was evolving naturally, as Curtis's career demands increased. Looking back now, I can see the pattern with crystal clarity. Each compromise presented as temporary, each sacrifice framed as an investment in our shared future. It started with the cooking classes. I'd been taking advanced pastry techniques at the Institute every Thursday evening, working toward my certification in French patisserie. The classes were expensive, but represented my commitment to eventually opening my own restaurant. Curtis had initially been supportive, even proud of my dedication. "You should probably skip class this week," he said casually one Thursday morning, during his second year on city council. "The Hendersons are hosting a dinner for potential campaign donors, and I really need you there. These people respond well to couples, and Sarah Henderson specifically asked if you'd be coming." One missed class became 2, then 5. Eventually, Curtis suggested I withdraw altogether. "Once the campaign season is over, you can always start again," he assured me. "But right now, your presence at these events is crucial. You're my secret weapon, remember?" I withdrew from the program, telling myself it was temporary. The certificate could wait. Supporting my husband's political career was the priority. The same pattern emerged with my job at the boutique catering company, where I'd been working as a sous chef. Initially, Curtis bragged about my culinary skills to his colleagues, often requesting that I cater intimate dinners for important contacts. But as his political ambitions grew, my work schedule began conflicting with his social obligations. The Kramers want to host another fundraiser, and they specifically requested, "Your lamb Wellington," he said one evening. "But it's the same night as your company's James Beard dinner prep. Can't you get someone else to cover for you?" When I explained that missing the prep would mean losing a major professional opportunity, Curtis's disappointment was palpable. "I thought we were building this together," he said quietly. "But it feels like your job is becoming more important than our future." The guilt was devastating. I called in sick to the James Beard dinner and spent the evening serving my lamb Wellington to donors who praised Curtis for having such a talented wife, while treating me like elegant catering equipment rather than a professional chef. Within 6 months, I'd left the catering company entirely. Curtis presented it as liberation from a demanding boss who didn't appreciate my talents. "You're so much more than a line cook," he insisted. "These freelance catering gigs for my events are perfect. You're working for yourself, building relationships with people who actually matter." But the freelance work wasn't building my career. It was making me an extension of Curtis's political machine. I cooked for his donors, smiled at his fundraisers, and gradually became known not as Genevieve Sullivan the chef, but as Curtis Sterling's wife who happened to cook well. The physical changes came next, disguised as concern for my well-being. Curtis began commenting on my appearance with the loving attention of a devoted husband who wanted me to look my best. "Have you been sleeping okay?" he asked one morning, studying my reflection in our bathroom mirror. "You look tired lately. Maybe we should find you a good esthetician." The esthetician led to a personal trainer, who led to a nutritionist, who led to a complete lifestyle overhaul designed to help me optimize my potential as a political spouse. Each professional was presented as a gift, a way for Curtis to invest in my happiness and confidence. But happiness wasn't the goal. Control was. The personal trainer eliminated the physical activities I enjoyed, replacing my weekend hiking with targeted exercises designed to achieve a specific body type. The nutritionist replaced my intuitive relationship with food with rigid meal plans that left me constantly hungry and obsessing over calories. The esthetician convinced me that my natural skin was problematic and required an extensive regimen of treatments and products. I lost 15 pounds, gained a wardrobe full of clothes. Curtis had helped me choose and developed a beauty routine that took 90 minutes every morning. Politicians' wives complimented my transformation, and Curtis beamed with pride as he introduced his stunning wife at events. But I no longer recognized myself in mirrors or photographs. The vibrant, confident woman who had dreamed of opening a restaurant had been systematically replaced by a polished, hollow version designed to enhance Curtis's image. The social isolation was perhaps the cruelest manipulation because it felt so natural. My friendships with other chefs and restaurant workers became casualties of scheduling conflicts. Carmen, conveniently, was always available to step in when my other friends couldn't attend Curtis's events. Carmen really gets the political world, Curtis would say approvingly after she'd charmed another donor or navigated a delicate conversation with perfect political instincts. She understands what it takes to succeed in this environment. Gradually, Carmen became my primary social connection. Outside of Curtis's political circle, she was my shopping companion, my confidant, my link to female friendship in a world where I increasingly felt isolated and uncertain of my own judgment. "You're so lucky to have Curtis," she would tell me during our coffee dates, where I found myself confessing doubts I couldn't share with my husband. "He's going places, and he's taking you with him. Not every man would be so committed to including his wife in his success." The financial control was the final piece, implemented so smoothly that I barely noticed it happening. Curtis consolidated our accounts for efficiency, took over paying all bills to reduce stress, and gradually assumed complete control over our financial life. "You shouldn't have to worry about money," he explained when I asked about accessing our savings to take a business course. "That's what husbands are for. Just focus on being happy and supporting our goals." By our 5th anniversary, I had no independent income, no professional relationships outside Curtis's sphere, no hobbies, or interests that didn't directly support his career, and no financial autonomy. I had become exactly what Curtis needed: a beautiful, accomplished, devoted political wife, with no identity or resources independent of his success. And through it all, Carmen had watched, learned, and positioned herself as everything I used. To be before Curtis's careful cultivation had transformed me into something more useful to his ambitions. My phone buzzed with a text from my private investigator. "Urgent. Carmen Rodriguez has outstanding warrants. Need to meet immediately. I." Stepped away from the observation mirror, my heart racing as I processed this unexpected development. Mike appeared at my elbow, his expression grim. "Chef, we have a situation developing in the main dining room. There's a woman at table 8 who's been watching the Wellington room entrance for the past 20 minutes. She looks distressed." I followed Mike back into the main restaurant, scanning the dining room until I spotted her. A petite brunette in her early 30s sat alone at table 8, her elegant black dress and pearl earrings suggesting wealth, but her body language screamed anxiety. She kept checking her phone, glancing toward the private dining room and fidgeting with her wedding ring. As I approached her table, she looked up with eyes that were red-rimmed but determined. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "Are you the manager?" "I need to speak with someone about a private matter. I'm Genevieve Sterling, the owner." "How can I help you?" Her face went pale. "Sterling? You're married to Curtis Sterling?" "For now," I replied carefully, noting the way her hands trembled as she set down her wine glass. "I'm Molly Brooks," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tanner's wife, and I think we need to talk." The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. This wasn't just about Curtis's affair or even his planned divorce strategy. Tanner Brooks was conducting business that apparently his own wife knew nothing about, and her presence here couldn't be a coincidence. "Would you like to join me at a more private table?" I suggested, gesturing toward a quiet corner booth that would allow us to speak without being overheard. Molly nodded gratefully, gathering her purse with shaking hands. As we settled into the booth, she pulled out her phone and showed me a series of text messages. "Tanner told me he was working late tonight, reviewing briefs for a custody case. But I found these messages on his iPad this afternoon when I was trying to download a recipe. The texts were between Tanner and someone identified only as C, clearly Curtis. The conversation revealed a level of personal investment in my destruction that went far beyond professional legal services. "Can't wait to see her face when she realizes she's getting nothing," read one message from Tanner. "Carmen says Genevieve actually thinks she could run a restaurant someday." "The delusion is almost sad," Curtis had replied. "By the time we're done, she'll be lucky to afford a studio apartment in Queens. Then you and Carmen can start fresh without any financial complications." Molly's voice was steady despite her obvious distress. "There are dozens of these messages going back months. Tanner has been planning your destruction like it's some kind of personal vendetta. This isn't normal attorney-client communication. I studied Molly's face, recognizing something familiar in her expression. The same hollow look I'd seen in my own mirror during the worst periods of my marriage. "How long has he been treating you this way?" "What do you mean?" "The way you're sitting, the way you apologized before asking for help, the way you keep checking to make sure no one's watching us." I recognized the signs. Molly's composure cracked, slightly. 15 years. We met in law school and he was brilliant, charming, going places. I supported him through the bar exam, through starting his practice, through building his reputation. And gradually, I became invisible. Except when he needed you to be visible. Exactly. The perfect attorney's wife for client dinners and bar association events, but never a partner, never an equal. Just an accessory that could be put away when not needed. I pulled out my own phone and showed her some of the recordings from the Wellington room. "Your husband is in there right now, helping my husband and his mistress plan to leave me destitute. But what they don't know is that I'm not the helpless wife they think I am." Molly listened to the audio with growing anger, her face transforming from defeated resignation to focused rage. "Carmen Rodriguez," she said suddenly. "I know that name. Tanner mentioned her months ago, said she was a potential client with immigration issues." "What kind of immigration issues?" "That's just it. He was vague about the details, which isn't like Tanner. He documents everything, keeps meticulous records. But when I asked about the Rodriguez case, he said it was confidential, and changed the subject. I thought about my private investigator's text about warrants. Molly, what if I told you that Carmen might not be who she claims to be, and that your husband might be more involved in this than just providing legal services?" She leaned forward, her earlier nervousness replaced by sharp focus. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if this isn't just about destroying my marriage for Curtis's political convenience? What if there's something else going on? Something that explains why Tanner is so personally invested in making sure I end up with nothing?" Molly was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing implications I hadn't fully articulated yet. "Tanner has been working late more often, taking calls he says are confidential, traveling for client meetings that never appear on his official calendar. And the money? What about it? Has his income changed recently? New expenses, luxury purchases, anything that doesn't match his usual legal fees?" Molly's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "The house in the Hamptons. He said it was a smart investment, that we could afford it because of a big settlement he'd just secured. But when I asked him about it, he said the details were subject to attorney-client privilege." We stared at each other across the table, both realizing that our husband's betrayal might be more complicated and more criminal than either of us had imagined. "Molly," I said carefully, "how would you feel about helping me expose whatever this really is? Because I don't think either of us is going to find justice by suffering in silence." She straightened her shoulders, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked like the accomplished law school graduate she'd once been, rather than the diminished wife she'd become. "What do you need me to do?" My private investigator, David Chen, arrived at Lumiere within 20 minutes of my urgent call. I'd known David for 3 years. He'd been instrumental in helping me establish the shell companies that protected my ownership of the restaurant. His discreet investigations had saved me from several bad business partnerships and one potentially disastrous real estate deal. "This is bigger than adultery," David said without preamble as he slid into our corner booth, placing a thick manila envelope on the table. "Carmen Rodriguez doesn't exist." Molly's sharp intake of breath was audible. "What do you mean?" "I mean the woman your husbands are conspiring with is using a stolen identity. The real Carmen Rodriguez died in a car accident in Phoenix 2 years ago. Whoever this woman is, she's been living under a dead woman's name, complete with social security number, credit history, and educational credentials." I felt the blood drain from my face. "But she was my maid of honor. I've known her for 8 years. Have you?" David opened the envelope and spread out a series of photographs and documents. "Because according to these records, the woman calling herself Carmen Rodriguez only appeared in New York 3 years ago, which coincidentally is exactly when your marriage started showing signs of strain." The photographs were surveillance, shots of Carmen, but also included images of documents, bank records, and what appeared to be multiple forms of identification. David pointed to a passport photo that showed Carmen's face but bore the name Maria Santos. "She's wanted by the FBI for identity theft, wire fraud, and running a marriage scam operation that targeted wealthy men in 3 different states. The pattern is always the same. She infiltrates their social circle through a female friend, builds trust over time, then systematically destroys the marriage while positioning herself as the perfect replacement." Molly leaned forward, studying the documents. Tanner knew. He had to have known. You can't conduct legal business with someone without verifying their identity. "That's where it gets interesting," David continued. "Your husband isn't just Carmen's attorney, he's her partner. The Hamptons house you mentioned? It was purchased through a shell company that traces back to accounts in the Cayman Islands. Accounts that have been receiving regular deposits from 3 different men over the past 5 years. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. This wasn't just about Curtis leaving me for another woman. It was about a sophisticated operation designed to systematically destroy wealthy marriages and steal assets through carefully orchestrated legal manipulation. "She's done this before," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "Curtis isn't her first target. He's her third that we can verify," David confirmed. "The pattern is always the same. She befriends the wife, gains intimate knowledge of the marriage's vulnerabilities, then begins a carefully timed affair while simultaneously feeding information to Tanner Brooks, who positions himself as the husband's divorce attorney." "But why Curtis?" Molly asked. "If she's targeting wealth, there are richer men in the city." David smiled grimly. "Because Curtis Sterling isn't just wealthy, he's politically ambitious. And political connections are worth more than money when you're running a long-term con. Think about the access she's gained through Curtis's campaign. Donor lists, insider information about real estate development projects, connections to judges and federal officials. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Carmen hadn't just stolen Curtis from me. She'd turned him into an unwitting accomplice in a criminal enterprise. Every donor meeting, every campaign event, every political connection had been an opportunity for intelligence gathering. The divorce isn't the endgame, I realized aloud. It's the setup for whatever comes next. Exactly. Once Curtis marries Carmen, she'll have legitimate access to everything: his political network, his family's real estate empire, his campaign funds. And if he becomes a federal candidate like he's planning, she'll have access to information that's worth millions to the right buyers. Molly was studying Tanner's text messages again, her expression growing more determined. "These aren't just about your divorce. Look at this one from last week." She showed me a message from Tanner to Curtis. "Carmen's contact in the planning. Commission confirms the zoning change will be approved next month. We should finalize the purchase of the Tribeca properties before the announcement." "Insider trading," David said immediately. They're using Curtis's political connections to get advance information about zoning changes, then investing in properties that will increase in value once the changes are announced. How much money are we talking about? I asked. Based on the property records I was able to access, they've already profited about $12 million from 4 different real estate deals over the past 18 months. And that's just what I could trace without a federal investigation. The restaurant around us continued its elegant dinner service, completely oblivious to the fact that we were unraveling a criminal conspiracy that stretched far beyond a simple marital betrayal. I thought about all the times Curtis had come home from campaign meetings with inside information about city planning decisions, all the casual conversations about real estate opportunities that seemed to fall into his lap. They're planning to destroy me financially, not just out of cruelty, I said slowly, but because they need me to be powerless. A bitter ex-wife with resources could expose their operation. Which is why the prenup was so important, Molly added. Tanner needed to ensure you'd have no money to hire investigators or lawyers who might discover the truth. David nodded. And Carmen needed to eliminate you completely from Curtis's life, so you wouldn't be around to notice discrepancies in his income or ask questions about his new business ventures. I looked toward the Wellington room where my husband was currently planning my destruction with 2 criminals who had manipulated him so skillfully that he believed he was the mastermind. David, how much evidence do you have that would stand up in federal court? Enough to open an investigation, but we'd need more to guarantee convictions. Financial records, recorded conversations, documentation of the insider trading. I smiled, for the first time all evening. What if I told you I had hours of recorded conversations from tonight, complete financial access to Curtis's accounts, and a very powerful motivation to see justice done? Molly reached across the table and squeezed my hand. What if you had 2 very motivated women with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from exposing the truth? David's expression shifted from professional concern to predatory anticipation. Then I'd say Carmen Rodriguez, or whoever she really is, picked the wrong targets this time. With David's revelation about the criminal conspiracy, our approach had to shift dramatically. This wasn't just about exposing an affair anymore. We were building a case that could send all 3 conspirators to federal prison for decades. We need to be surgical about this, David explained, pulling out a digital tablet and opening an encrypted app. One wrong move and they'll scatter like cockroaches. Carmen has already disappeared twice when investigations got too close in other states. Molly was photographing Tanner's text messages with a camera David had given her, one that would preserve metadata and timestamps that could be authenticated in court. How much time do we have? Based on their conversation in the Wellington room, they're planning to accelerate the divorce proceedings starting Monday morning, I said, checking my own recordings. Tanner mentioned filing emergency motions to freeze assets and claim I'm mentally unstable. Classic pattern, David noted grimly. They'll paint you as an unfit wife who's become paranoid and delusional. Makes it easier to justify keeping you away from financial records that might expose their crimes. I thought about all the times Curtis had suggested I seemed stressed or not quite myself lately. Every missed social event, every evening I'd claimed to be tired instead of attending his political functions, every moment of distraction that was actually me building Lumiere. It had all been carefully documented to support a narrative of mental decline. They've been building this case for months, I realized. Curtis has been setting me up to look unstable long before Carmen made her final move. Which means we have one advantage they don't expect, Molly said with growing confidence. They think they're dealing with 2 broken, dependent wives. They have no idea what we're actually capable of. David smiled approvingly. Exactly, so here's what we're going to do. Molly, I need you to go home and access Tanner's home computer. He'll have backup files for everything. Lawyers are paranoid about data loss. Look for anything related to Carmen Rodriguez, Maria Santos, or the Cayman Island accounts. What if he's encrypted everything? He probably has, But men like Tanner always keep a paper trail somewhere. Check his home office, especially any safety deposit box keys or offshore banking information. Also, look for travel records. If he's been making trips to the Cayman Islands or Phoenix, we need documentation. I pulled out my phone and accessed Lumiere's security system. I can give you real-time access to everything happening in the Wellington room. David, what specific evidence do we need for the federal charges? Wire fraud requires proof they used electronic communications to execute the scheme. We've got that in Tanner's texts. Money laundering needs evidence of financial transactions designed to hide illegal profits. That's the Cayman accounts and the shell companies. The insider trading requires proof they used Curtis's political position to gain advance information for financial benefit. The recordings from tonight should cover the insider trading, I said, scrolling through the audio files. They've been discussing real estate purchases based on advanced knowledge of zoning changes. Perfect. But we also need to document the identity theft and marriage fraud. Carmen's been using stolen credentials to access bank accounts, secure credit, and establish legal residency. If we can prove she's committed these crimes while married to or engaged to multiple men simultaneously, we can add bigamy charges. Molly was taking notes with the focused intensity of someone who'd remembered she used to be a lawyer. What about the assets they've already stolen? Can we recover the money they've taken from previous victims? If we can trace it, yes. Federal asset forfeiture laws allow us to seize anything purchased with criminal proceeds. That Hampton's house, luxury cars, jewelry, investment accounts, all of it can be recovered and returned to victims. I thought about the sophisticated operation they'd built and the careful timing of tonight's dinner. They're planning something bigger than just my divorce. David, check Curtis's campaign schedule for the next month. I think they're positioning for a major score. David pulled up Curtis's public calendar on his tablet. He's got a fundraising dinner next week with major real estate developers, followed by a private meeting with the Planning Commission about the Hudson River Development Project. That's a $50 billion development, I said, remembering Curtis's excitement about being included in those discussions. If Carmen can get advance information about which properties will be rezoned for commercial use, she and Tanner could make hundreds of millions in profits, David finished, and Curtis would be completely unaware he was facilitating the crime. The scope of what we were uncovering was staggering. Carmen hadn't just targeted Curtis for his wealth, she'd identified him as the perfect vehicle for accessing information that could generate massive illegal profits. His political ambitions and trusting nature made him the ideal unwitting accomplice. There's something else, Molly said quietly. If Carmen is wanted by the FBI, why hasn't she been caught? How has she been able to operate under a stolen identity? For 3 years in New York without detection? David's expression darkened. Because she's had help from someone with access to law enforcement databases. Someone who could scrub records, delay investigations, and provide advance warning about federal interest. Tanner, I said with growing certainty. His law firm does white-collar criminal defense. He has contacts in the Justice Department, relationships with federal prosecutors. Which means this conspiracy goes deeper than we thought, David confirmed. Tanner isn't just Carmen's business partner. He's been actively protecting her from federal investigation while helping her target new victims. The full magnitude of what we were facing settled over our table like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about recovering stolen assets or exposing an affair. We were taking on a criminal network that had been operating successfully for years, with the protection of corrupt legal and political connections. Are we in over our heads? Molly asked, voicing what we were all thinking. I looked around my restaurant, the empire I'd built in secret while being systematically undermined and dismissed. No, I said with quiet conviction. We're exactly where we need to be. They made one crucial mistake. What's that? They chose to destroy us in a place where I hold all the power, surrounded by people who are loyal to me, while documenting their crimes with recording equipment they don't know exists. Tonight, they're going to hand us everything we need to destroy them. While David briefed Molly on evidence collection techniques, I excused myself to make the most important phone call of my life. My hands were steady as I dialed the direct number for FBI Special Agent Rebecca Martinez, whom I'd met 2 years ago when she'd investigated money laundering at a competing restaurant. She'd given me her card, half joking that if I ever encountered financial crimes in the hospitality industry, I should call her directly. Agent Martinez, this is Genevieve Sterling from Lumiere. I have a situation that requires immediate federal attention. Mrs. Sterling? It's nearly midnight. What kind of situation? Wire fraud, money laundering, insider trading, and identity theft. Currently happening in my restaurant. I have recorded evidence and live surveillance of the perpetrators planning their next crimes. There was a pause. How certain are you about this? Certain enough to risk my marriage, my reputation, and my safety to expose it. Agent Martinez, I need you to understand, this isn't a domestic dispute that's gotten out of hand. This is a sophisticated criminal operation that's been running for years. I'm listening. I gave her a rapid but comprehensive overview of what David had discovered, the evidence we'd gathered, and the crimes being planned in the Wellington room. Agent Martinez asked sharp, specific questions that told me she was taking this seriously. Mrs. Sterling, I need you to maintain normal behavior until my team arrives. Do not confront the subjects, do not alter their environment, and do not give them any reason to suspect they're under surveillance. Can you do that? Yes. How long do you need? 20 minutes for a tactical team, 45 for a full investigation. Unit. The evidence you're describing could break open a case we've been building for 2 years. After ending the call, I returned to our corner table where David was showing Molly how to use a covert recording device. The contrast between our quiet preparation and the oblivious celebration happening 30 feet away in the Wellington room was almost surreal. Federal agents are en route, I reported. We have 45 minutes to finalize everything. David nodded approvingly. Molly, you need to leave now and access Tanner's files. The FBI will want to coordinate a simultaneous search of his office and home. Can you get us inside legally? I'm his wife. I have keys to everything, Molly said with new determination. And as of tonight, I'm also a cooperating witness in a federal investigation. After Molly left, David and I reviewed our evidence one final time. The recordings from the Wellington room contained clear discussions of insider trading, money laundering, through shell companies, and plans to accelerate my financial destruction before any investigation could begin. The documentation about Carmen's stolen identity and Tanner's role in protecting her created a compelling case for conspiracy charges. There's one more thing we need to consider, David said quietly. Curtis isn't just a victim in this. His political career is over. Even if he was manipulated, the optics of being involved with a wanted criminal will destroy any future he'd planned. I felt a complex mix of emotions about Curtis's impending downfall. Part of me still remembered the idealistic young politician I'd fallen in love with, the man who'd genuinely wanted to improve his community. But that man had been replaced by someone willing to destroy me for his own advancement, someone who'd chosen cruelty over compassion when it served his purposes. He made his choices, I said finally. I'm not responsible for protecting him from the consequences. Through the restaurant's main windows, I could see unmarked federal vehicles beginning to position themselves around the building. Agent Martinez was coordinating an operation that would simultaneously arrest the conspirators while preserving all evidence. The FBI had been tracking Carmen for 2 years without success. Tonight would be their chance to end her criminal career permanently. Agnes appeared at my table, her expression carefully neutral despite the unusual activity she'd undoubtedly noticed. Chef, the Wellington room has requested their check. Should I prepare it normally? I almost laughed at the absurd irony. After hours of planning my destruction, Curtis was ready to pay for the privilege using what he assumed was our joint credit card. Yes, but make sure they understand that payment is required before leaving. No exceptions. As Agnes walked away, I realized this might be the last normal moment I'd have for a very long time. Once the arrests began, my life would become a whirlwind of federal investigations, media attention, and legal proceedings. The quiet empire I'd built in secret would be exposed to public scrutiny. But I wasn't afraid anymore. The woman who'd spent 7 years shrinking herself to fit Curtis's vision of the perfect political wife was gone. In her place was someone who'd learned to build power in silence, who'd mastered the art of strategic patience, who'd inherited the strength of women who'd survived by being underestimated. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Martinez. Team in position. Maintain normal. Operations until my signal. I stood up and smoothed my dress, checking my reflection one final time in the mirror behind our booth. In 5 minutes, I was going to walk into that private dining room and watch my husband's carefully constructed world collapse around him. But first, I had one more call to make. Mike, it's time to serve dessert to the Wellington room. Make sure it's absolutely perfect. It's going to be their last meal as free people. I walked toward the Wellington room with the measured pace of someone who had all the time in the world. My heels clicked against the marble floor in perfect rhythm, each step carrying me closer to a confrontation that would end one life and begin another. The dining room around me continued its elegant dance of service and conversation, completely unaware that they were about to witness the conclusion of a federal investigation. Through the partially open door of the Wellington room, I could hear Curtis's voice rising with excitement as he described his vision for the future. Once the divorce is finalized and I marry Carmen, we'll have the perfect political partnership. She understands strategy in ways Genevieve never could. To new beginnings, Carmen's voice chimed in, followed by the clink of champagne glasses. I paused at the threshold, taking in the scene before me. Curtis sat at the head of the mahogany table, his sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened with the casual confidence of a man who believed he controlled everything around him. Carmen was positioned to his right, her red dress and auburn hair catching the warm light from the crystal chandelier I'd personally selected for this room. Tanner occupied the seat across from her, surrounded by legal documents and financial statements that represented their plan to destroy my life. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were conducting this celebration in a room I owned, drinking wine I'd chosen, planning to steal assets I'd accumulated while building the very empire that surrounded them. Well, I said, stepping into the room with a smile that felt sharp as a blade, this looks like quite the celebration. Curtis's head snapped up, his expression shifting from surprise to annoyance to barely concealed anger in the space of 2 seconds. Genevieve, what are you doing here? Having dinner at my favorite restaurant, I replied smoothly, allowing my gaze to sweep across the documents scattered on the table. Though it looks like you've been conducting business rather than enjoying your meal. How very, like you. Carmen's laugh was too bright, too forced. Curtis mentioned you'd been struggling lately. It's so brave of you to come out tonight instead of staying home. The casual cruelty of the comment, the implication that I was somehow fragile or unstable, revealed everything I needed to know about how they'd been framing my behavior. Every missed political event, every evening I'd claimed exhaustion, every moment I'd seemed distracted had been carefully cataloged to support their narrative of my mental decline. Struggling? I repeated, genuinely curious about their interpretation. That's an interesting way to describe building something extraordinary, while everyone around you assumes you're doing nothing at all. Tanner cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with my unexpected presence. Perhaps we should continue this discussion at another time. This is a private dining room. Yes, I agreed pleasantly. It is, which is why I'm curious about why you're here at all, Mr. Brooks. I wasn't aware that Curtis had any legal matters requiring immediate attention on our anniversary. The three of them exchanged glances that confirmed they hadn't expected to be questioned about their presence together. In their planning, they'd assumed I would be home, devastated and isolated. probably crying into a bottle of wine while they celebrated their victory. Tanner is helping me with some routine legal matters, Curtis said dismissively. Nothing that concerns you? Routine legal matters involving Carmen? I asked, noting how Carmen's hand tightened on her champagne glass. How thoughtful of you. To include her in such discussions. Carmen is my campaign manager, Curtis replied with the rehearsed tone of someone who'd practiced this explanation. She has a legitimate interest in ensuring that my personal affairs don't create complications for the campaign. I nodded as if this made perfect sense, all while noting the defensive positions they'd unconsciously assumed. Curtis had straightened in his chair, putting distance between himself and the incriminating documents. Carmen had shifted slightly away from the table, as if preparing to leave quickly if necessary. Tanner had begun gathering papers with the nervous efficiency of someone who didn't want his materials examined too closely. Of course, I said. I imagine campaign management requires quite a lot of personal involvement these days. The tension in the room was palpable as I moved closer to the table, my eyes scanning the documents they'd tried to conceal. Financial statements, property deeds, and what appeared to be campaign finance records were spread across the mahogany surface like evidence in a criminal investigation. You know what's fascinating about campaign management? I continued conversationally, picking up one of the papers before Curtis could stop me. The level of financial oversight required. All those donor contributions, expense reports, compliance, documents. Put that down, Curtis said sharply, his political composure finally cracking. That's confidential campaign business. Is it? I studied the document in my hands, a property acquisition form for a building in Tribeca that was dated next month but signed yesterday. Because this looks more like real estate speculation based on insider information about zoning changes. The color drained from Tanner's face. You don't understand what you're looking at, don't I? I set the paper down and picked up another one, this time a bank statement showing wire transfers to an account in the Cayman Islands. Because I'm looking at what appears to be money laundering through offshore accounts. And this, I held up, a third document. Looks like a false identity application for someone named Maria Santos. Carmen's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor in a spray of crystal and wine. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence as all three of them realized their carefully guarded secrets were scattered across the table for anyone to see. Who exactly are you, Carmen? I asked quietly. Because Carmen Rodriguez died in a car accident in Phoenix 2 years ago. You're talking nonsense, Curtis blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. Carmen, tell her she's wrong. For the first time since I'd known her, Carmen had nothing to say. The confident, polished woman who had systematically stolen my life was staring at me with something approaching terror. The FBI has been looking for Maria Santos for quite some time, I continued, noting how Carmen flinched at the name. Wire fraud, identity theft, marriage fraud across multiple states. Quite an impressive criminal resume. Tanner was frantically gathering papers, his hands shaking as he tried to stuff incriminating evidence back into his briefcase. This is absurd. These are legitimate business documents. Are they? Because Special Agent Martinez of the FBI seems to think otherwise. She's been investigating this operation for 2 years. The mention of an active federal investigation sent all three of them into a panic. Curtis shot to his feet, his chair, toppling backward with a crash that echoed through the private dining room. You're bluffing, he said, but I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. There's no investigation. You're just trying to cause trouble because you're upset about the divorce. Am I? I smiled and pulled out my phone, showing them the active call to Agent Martinez. Would you like to ask her yourself? The door to the Wellington room opened with perfect timing as Agent Martinez entered, followed by 4 FBI agents in tactical gear. The sight of federal law enforcement officers caused Carmen to bolt for the rear exit, but she found her path blocked by 2 more agents who had anticipated her escape route. Maria Santos, Agent Martinez said, her voice carrying the authority. of someone who'd been hunting this criminal for years. "You're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit federal crimes." Curtis stood frozen in the center of the room, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror as he realized the woman he'd planned to marry was a wanted federal criminal. Curtis Sterling and Tanner Brooks, Agent Martinez, continued, "You're also under arrest for conspiracy, wire fraud, and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent." As the Miranda rights filled the air, I watched 7 years of marriage and manipulation crumble into handcuffs and federal charges. Curtis's political career was over. Carmen's criminal enterprise was finished, and Tanner's corrupt legal practice was about to face federal scrutiny that would destroy everything he'd built. The only sound in the room was the click of handcuffs and the quiet weeping of 3 people who had finally met consequences they couldn't charm, manipulate, or lawyer their way out of. As the FBI agents escorted Curtis, Carmen, and Tanner out of the Wellington room in handcuffs, I remained standing beside the mahogany table where their criminal conspiracy had been laid bare. The scattered documents that had once represented my destruction now served as evidence that would send them to federal prison for decades. Curtis turned back to look at me one final time as Agent Martinez guided him toward the door. His face was a mask of disbelief and something that might have been betrayal, as if I had somehow wronged him by exposing his crimes. "Genevieve," he said, his voice carrying a note of desperate confusion, "you don't understand what you've done. My career, my future, you've destroyed everything." I looked at the man I'd been married to for 7 years, this stranger who had systematically dismantled my identity while planning to steal everything I'd built. The hurt was still there, sharp and immediate, but it was overshadowed by something more powerful: absolute clarity about who he really was. "No, Curtis," I replied quietly, my voice carrying across the elegant dining room where we'd celebrated what he'd intended to be the end of our marriage. "You destroyed everything. I just made sure there were consequences." Agent Martinez paused in the doorway, allowing Curtis one last moment to speak. Perhaps she understood that some conversations needed to happen, even between criminals and their victims. "You never could have afforded a place like this," Curtis said with a bitter laugh that contained no humor. "You never could have built anything without me. After the divorce, you'll have nothing." The irony was so perfect, so complete, that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I walked to the head of the table where Curtis had been sitting just minutes before, my hand resting on the mahogany surface that he'd used as a desk for planning my destruction. Around us, the elegant private dining room reflected the warm light of crystal chandeliers. Italian marble gleamed under soft lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Central Park. "Curtis," I said, my voice steady and clear, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, "meet my staff." I gestured toward Agnes, who stood in the doorway with the dignity of someone who'd served the most powerful people in New York for 3 years. Toward Evan, whose impeccable management had made Lumiere the most sought-after reservation in Manhattan. Toward Mike, whose culinary genius had earned us reviews that established restaurants would kill for. "This is my restaurant. I own it. I built it. Every marble tile, every crystal chandelier, every perfectly prepared dish that you've been enjoying. Tonight represents my vision, my investment, my success." Curtis's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a dawning horror as he realized the full scope of what he'd never known about his wife. "The prenup you're so proud of?" I continued, pulling out my phone to show him the shell company documentation that David had prepared years ago. "It protects your assets from me, not mine from you. Everything I inherited from my grandmother, everything I built during our marriage, everything you assumed didn't exist. It's all mine. Completely, legally, permanently mine." The federal agents waited patiently as Curtis processed the magnitude of his miscalculation. He'd planned to destroy a helpless, dependent wife and instead had attacked a successful businesswoman with resources he couldn't imagine and connections he'd never suspected. "Oh, and honey?" I said, borrowing his condescending tone and turning it back on him with perfect precision. "Get out of my restaurant." Agent Martinez nodded approvingly and guided Curtis toward the exit. As they reached the door, I heard him ask in a broken voice, "How long have you known? About the restaurant? 3 years? About Carmen being a criminal? Tonight. About you being capable of this level of cruelty?" I paused, considering the question honestly. I think I've known that for longer than I was willing to admit. The door closed behind them with the soft click of finality, leaving me alone in the private dining room where my marriage had officially ended and my real life had finally begun. 6 months later, I stood in the same Wellington room where everything had changed, but this time I wasn't alone. Molly Brooks sat across from me, her transformation as dramatic as my own. The broken, diminished woman who had approached my table that night was gone, replaced by someone who carried herself with the confidence of a federal witness whose testimony had helped dismantle a criminal enterprise. "The sentencing hearing is next week," she said, closing her laptop after reviewing the final witness statements. "Tanner's looking at 15 to 20 years. Carmen, or Maria Santos, got 25 to life as a repeat offender, and Curtis, 12 years," I finished, feeling nothing but quiet satisfaction. Plus forfeiture of all assets purchased with criminal proceeds. The federal investigation had unraveled a conspiracy that stretched back 8 years and involved 17 victims across 5 states. Carmen's marriage fraud operation had stolen over $40 million from wealthy men who had trusted her, with their hearts and their fortunes. Tanner's corrupt legal practice had enabled every theft, every identity change, every strategic divorce that left victims financially and emotionally destroyed. Curtis's political career had ended the night of his arrest, but his legal troubles were just beginning. The insider trading charges alone carried a 10-year sentence, and his cooperation with the federal investigation had only reduced his time marginally. The man who had once dreamed of becoming a senator was now preparing for more than a decade in federal prison. "Have you heard from him?" Molly asked gently. She'd become more than an ally in our fight for justice. She'd become the closest friend I'd had since Carmen's betrayal. "His lawyer called last week requesting a meeting. Something about wanting to apologize before sentencing." I shook my head, still amazed by Curtis's inability to understand the magnitude of what he'd done. I declined. Some conversations don't need to happen. Through the windows of the Wellington room, Central Park stretched out in the golden light of late afternoon. Lumiere had not only survived the media attention from the federal case, it had thrived. Being the restaurant where a major FBI operation concluded had only added to our mystique. Reservations were booked solid for 8 months, and 3 major food magazines had featured us on their covers. But the real victory wasn't professional success, it was personal. I'd reclaimed not just my dignity and my assets, but my sense of self. The woman who had spent 7 years shrinking to fit someone else's vision was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to apologize for it. "What's next for you?" Molly asked, gathering her papers as our meeting concluded. I smiled, thinking about the culinary school I was planning to open, the cookbook deal I'd just signed, and the speech I'd been invited to give at the Women's Business Leadership Conference next month. "Everything Curtis never thought I was capable of," I said. And then some. As Molly left for her own new life, law school at 42, determined to become the prosecutor she'd always dreamed of being, I remained in the Wellington room for a few more minutes. This space had witnessed the end of one life and the beginning of another. It had been the stage for the most spectacular revenge story in recent New York history. But more than that, it had been the place where I finally learned that the most powerful thing you can do to someone who has underestimated you is simply to succeed beyond their wildest imagination. The house always wins, especially when you own the house. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.